Well, good morning and welcome to the October 2021 board meeting held in public of the Medicines and the Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or the MHRA as we prefer to call it. My name is Stephen Lightfoot and I'm the chair of the board, and my role is to lead us through today's agenda. So for those of you who've not attended one of our board meetings before, I must start by saying that this is a board meeting held in public and it is not a public meeting. Having said that, we will provide an opportunity for members of the public to ask us questions at the end of our meeting. It's also important to explain that our board is responsible for the strategic leadership of the agency, and it does not make regulatory decisions on individual products, because that's very ably done by the officials within the agency with the support and advice of our independent expert committees. I also need to make you aware that we're going to be recording today's meeting so that we can publish the video on our website and to provide the opportunity for as many people as possible to observe the meeting. And I'm also delighted that 50 people have registered to observe our meeting this morning, with 15 people representing patients or patient groups. We've got 17 people from industry, 7 health professionals and government officials, 2 representatives of the media, and 9 members of our own staff. So thank you for joining us this morning. We'll also be joined online by colleagues from the Department of Health and the Devolved Administration. So in particular, I'd like to welcome Catherine Glover, who's the Deputy Director of Medicines Regulation and Prescribing at the Department of Health. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to welcome Professor Graham Cook. Graham, this is your first meeting as a non-executive director, and also we nominated you as the Deputy Chair of the Board. So welcome to your new responsibility and to the Board. Now, with introductions in mind, I think it would be probably quite useful just to go around the table and ask everyone just to introduce themselves with their name and their job title, just so the audience can see exactly who we all are. So June, start with you.
Good morning, my name's June Wren and I'm the CEO at the MHRA.
Hi, I'm Natalie Richards and I'm head of the Executive Office at the MHRA.
Good morning, I'm Raj Long. I'm a Deputy Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Good morning, my name is Michael Whitehouse. I'm Non-Executive Director and I'm also Chair of the agency's Audit Committee.
Good morning, my name is John Fundry and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at MHRA.
Hello, I'm Mandy Calvert. I'm a Non-Executive Director at MHRA and Chair of Organisation Development and Remuneration Committee.
Hi, good morning everybody. Junaid Badger, Non-Executive Director at MHRA.
I'm Mercy Jo Singham, Non-Executive Director and Chair of the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee.
Hi, good morning. Alison Cave, Chief Safety Officer at MHRA.
Morning, my name is Hayder Hussain. I'm an Associate Non-Executive Director.
Hi, my name's Graham Cook. I'm Non-Executive Director of the MHRA.
Good morning, my name's Mark Bailey. I'm Chief Science and Innovation Officer.
I'm Paul Goldsmith, Non-Executive Director and on the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee.
Good morning, Colin McGurry, Director of Governance at MHRA.
Great. Right, well thank you very much for that. You should all have access to the board pack of papers for today's meeting, and I'll use the page numbers in the board pack to keep us all on track. I'll also assume that everyone has read the papers so we can spend most of the time on discussion as opposed to presentation. We've got some pre-submitted questions from the public and members of the audience can also ask questions through the chat function on Zoom. Our Director of Communications, Rachel Bosworth, will come onto the screen later. She'll collect the questions and she'll ask as many of them so that we can answer as many of them as possible at the end of the meeting. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. Can I just check if there are any other observations or questions or comments? No? Okay, that's great. Well, that being the case, then let's move on to item number 2 on the agenda, which are apologies. So we do have apologies this morning from Sam Atkinson, the Interim Chief Quality and Access Officer, from John Quinn, the Interim Chief Technology Officer, from Greg Chalmers from the Scottish Government, Alison Strath, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer from Scotland, and Cathy Harrison, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer from Northern Ireland. I think our meeting has coincided with half-term for some of these individuals, unfortunately. Okay, the next item then is around declarations of interest, and I'd just like to start by making a declaration of my own, if that's okay. For those of you who've been on the board before, you'll know that I've been Deputy Chair of Sussex Community NHS Foundation Trust. I've also been the Chair of Sussex Primary Care Limited, and also a Director of Gainsborough Property Development UK Limited. All of those terms have now come to a close on the 30th of September, and so they are no longer active interests of mine. Having said that, I've now filled the time, as it was announced last week, that I've been appointed as the new chair designate for the NHS Integrated Care Board in Sussex. So I'll be one of the chairs of the 42 integrated care systems that have been set up within the NHS. And that role will start on the 1st of November. So I intend to split my time equally between the MHRA and the NHS. And I think actually that's probably helpful both ways, to be honest. So I'm really looking forward to doing that.
Well, Chair, can I offer congratulations on behalf of the agency? It's a superb opportunity as we seek to align our work with the NHS and serving the public. So please, I'd ask colleagues to offer warmest congratulations to Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. That was a nice surprise, actually. That wasn't on my script. But thank you, Drew. Very, very appreciated. Graham, you, as new to the board, can I just ask you to say your declarations, please?
Yeah, would you like me to go through them?
Yes, please.
So I work as a consultant to a number of companies, a company called DNA Nudge, which develops rapid point-of-care diagnostics, a company called 7 Sense Biosystems, which does home testing, a biotech company called 30 Technology, developing new therapeutics in nitric oxide, and Sanofi, where I work on a vaccine endpoint committee. I also provide advice to a company called Debevoise and Plimpton for their offices, and I have a role at WHO as chair of the WHO Selection of Essential Medicines Committee. And my salary is largely paid by NIHR.
Yeah.
So apart from that.
So yes, as NIHR professor, and you also conduct a number of clinical studies as well. So, okay, I think that's great, Graham. You know, I think we've obviously discussed that as part of your appointment. I don't see that as a fundamental conflict. It's important that we're transparent about these declarations. As I said at the beginning, you know, the agency board is not responsible for the individual regulatory decisions on either clinical trial approval or on individual products. But from the interest of transparency, it's important that we make that transparent, and we'll continue to monitor, as with all other board members, conflicts of interest to make sure that there is no conflict. Okay, are there any other declarations of interest that have not yet been made known to the board? No. Okay, thank you. That being the case then, if we can move to the board pack and move on to the minutes, please. That's on page 2 of the board pack. Can I first of all just check if the minutes are a true record of our last meeting in September?
I've got one query. On 8.2, under my assurance, it says the board provided comments. I just want to double check if it was the board or the committee's comments. And I obviously haven't been able to kind of see the recording, so I can't see. But from my recollection, the board didn't really have many comments, and I think this was the committee's.
I think there's probably a slight technicality there. I think what we try to do is that we don't attribute individual questions to individual board members, because otherwise we get into a competition of who's asked the most questions. So the general phrase used is normally the board commented.
But it wasn't, that's my query, it wasn't discussion at the board, it was actually, this is reflecting what the committee said.
Okay.
So maybe it's my kind of misunderstanding, but it was...
Which paragraph was that, Mercy?
It's 8.2.
8.2.
And it could be a combination. It could be what the board said as well as what the committee said, but it seems to me that this is more about what the committee said.
Okay, so we need to change the board to the committee. Yeah. Okay, I think that's completely fine actually. So, and that's, if we can make that change, that would be great. Yeah, you're right. The committee did provide comments.
Just one correction that I think I sent Natalie on 2.2. The company I work for is called Phoenix, not Phoenix.
Okay, if we can just get that correct as well. Okay, with those two comments, can we take those minutes as a true record of the meeting? Great. Okay. Let's say they're approved. Thank you very much, Natalie. If we then just move on to the actions on page number 8. I just want to go through the actions that are due today. We won't waste time going through the actions that are not yet due. But number 34, we had a conversation last month, June, around publishing the work on on our genomic medicines pathway.
Yes, there's been a slight hold up, but it's on its way.
goes away. So when do you expect that to be completed?
I would say in about 2 weeks. There's been some illness.
Ah, right, okay. Excellent. Okay, well, that'll be good to get that information into the public domain. Number 49 is actually on the agenda, so we'll cover that in the item. Number 53. So we discussed at a previous meeting around developing measures to monitor the impact of the deliverables and activities in response to the Cumberland Review. Alison, how's that progressing?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. So following the update to the board in July on the agency's short, medium, long-term deliverables from the Cumberland Review, we've been taking forward a piece of work on how to measure the impact of these deliverables. The programme of work currently has 3 key themes: patient and public engagement and involvement, a more responsive reporting system, and strengthened evidence for decision making. So we've been grateful for further input from the Cumberland Patient Reference Group when we met with them at the end of July, and that session helped us finalise our patient and public involvement strategy, and also advised and informed on how to measure the impact of what we're doing to address the concerns highlighted through the review. So we're currently undertaking a benefits mapping exercise where we're consolidating all the key activities in response to the Cumberland Review and mapping these with indicators and metrics to really track progress and understand what might be the longer term benefits associated with these various activities. And we hope to take that work to the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee in December and then through to the board in January.
Correct. Okay, I think that sounds very comprehensive, so thank you very much for that, Alison. And you're quite right on the board schedule of business. We've got a further update to the board in January, so that'll be the next major item for the board to consider. Item number 56. Carly, talking about putting appropriate mitigations in place for the new non-executive director declarations of interest.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So thank you to everyone for new declarations, particularly from our new non-executive members. Stephen, Natalie and I met last week to consider those, and I know that Natalie has been in touch with some of you with some follow-up questions to make sure we've got the accurate detail captured. As you will all appreciate, the aim of our conflict of interest approach is to provide maximum confidence in the operation of this board, and ensuring that we have maximum clarity and transparency is one of the ways that we can work to achieve that. So we'd be grateful for your timely responses to those follow-up queries, but any additional queries or uncertainties, then do please get in contact and we can get in touch. There's just a couple of other steps to update you all on to make sure that we are being as transparent as possible. So subject to getting that final information, we will publish the register of declared interests on the MHRA website as soon as possible, rather than waiting until we publish the annual report, which is around the middle of next calendar year. So that's in line with the ambition as we stated it in our conflict of interest policy, but it's an improvement on making sure that we get that information out there more quickly. As any new interests are declared over the year, we will update and republish that register. Equally, a copy of all declared interests will be available in each pack from November onwards, and this AIM-MBAR will enable all members of the board to raise queries on any potential conflicts and to help the chair determine whether we need to do any mitigation in those particular meetings, rather than trying to remember what may have been declared previously. As Stephen has already done today, you will also be asked at each meeting to declare any additional or new conflicts, as well as to notify the board in relation to any changes with existing declared interests. So for example, if a product were to move into regulatory stage from a company that you're advising, or a principal investigator seeking approval of a clinical trial, we would ask you to notify the board, and we will treat that as an addendum to the existing declared interest. And of course, if you expect to make a new declaration or an addendum, very grateful if you could let the chair and myself know in advance, in order that we can think about it prior to the meeting and any additional mitigations that might be needed. So a reminder that if conflicts are identified between a board member's interests and an item for discussion here, the relevant board member would be excused from that discussion of that item or items. And finally, you should have all received the COI policy, either on your recent induction or following its review earlier this year. As laid out in that policy, the onus of responsibility is on board members to identify and declare any potential conflicts, and there is guidance in that policy on what may constitute a conflict. But of course, any queries or any uncertainties, you're all very welcome to get in touch with myself and the Governance Office for further information.
Thank you, Carly. Can I just check if that's clear for everybody? Yeah. Again, the whole purpose of this, as Carly said, is it's all about public trust, and I think transparency is one of the ways that we can make sure that we're trusted as an organisation. It's very important. So I think these extra measures that we're taking, I think will be very helpful. And we've taken a real conscious decision to bring people onto the board with a wide range of experiences, because I think that will help the agency make better decisions. But the consequence of that is we need to manage conflicts of interest very carefully. So I think that's the point. Okay. I think if we just move on then to item number 57, we had a discussion around the board terms of reference last month. Carly, I know you weren't there, but just in terms of a quick update on what we're doing with that.
Yes, so thank you for the input on those. That's been incorporated into the terms of reference and will be circulated in due course.
Perfect. And then finally, we obviously had a technical difficulty at the last meeting where we were unable to record the second half of the meeting. We did go ahead with the meeting, that meeting did carry on, so we did certainly apologise to any members of the public that are watching today, and we're also cut off from the live stream last month. We've got a different technical setup this time, so I hope that won't be the case. Also, just to let you know that we had a number of pre-submitted questions which we did answer in the board meeting. And then June, I understand that you've actually also written to each person that asked a question.
That's correct, yeah.
So therefore, we've again completed the loop. So I'm sorry it wasn't done on video, but I just wanted to just assure the members of the public that we did complete the process. Okay, so there were the actions that were due today. Are there any other matters arising from the last meeting that anyone wishes to raise? No? Okay, that's great. Appreciate your time and support on that. So let's move on to the first substantive item on page number 10, and that's the report from the Chief Executive. June, what are the current issues from your point of view?
Well, thank you, Chair. And as you can see, it's a fairly comprehensive and detailed report, so I'll just give a couple of brief highlights. We usually stress the amount that the agency is contributing to the fight against COVID, but I think this report does bring out the complete range of other activities and deliverables. In terms of healthcare access, we've been delivering new medicines this month, in particular new cancer medicines, and particularly, as you see listed here, in relation to the Orbis work that we do with the FDA USA. And our innovative licensing and access pathway has continued to attract a lot of interest because of the impact it has on companies to know that questions are being proactively dealt with and we see an end-to-end delivery into healthcare. So a lot of work in that space, and it really does have a capacity to change the way we regulate. I'd like to highlight the work of NIBS, particularly its non-COVID work. Bacteriology division have been working on cholera vaccine, and there's an important piece of work on Group B streptococcus. So areas of work where, as we look ahead, a global impact is envisaged. And of course, we're aware, I think everyone knows about the type 2 polio vaccine, the new vaccine that will put a big dent in polio because it's designed to prevent the modifications that escape the old-fashioned viruses, vaccines. So really important work there. Devices have been working on our target product profiles for SARS-CoV-2 viral detection tests and the exceptional use authorization for the particular swab used in the NHS is really important for sample collection. So an enormous breadth of contribution in terms of making sure patients and healthcare have the products they need. But of course, patient safety, as we've already discussed, remains our top priority. Following the Cumberledge review, we've had the second release of registry data about valproate. It shows a continuing decline in prescribing, but there's much more work needed to be sure that individual women are getting the follow-up every year to use the product safely. In terms of our review of isotretinoin and the very valuable input from patients and families, we're progressing that actively at this moment, and perhaps we'll talk more about that later. But of course, COVID vaccine safety, again, continues to be monitored, and you'll see in the report a couple of important signals around delayed hypersensitivity reactions and indeed facial swelling in those who've had dermatological fillers. So rounding it all up together, a really busy and active month. Our staff, who are our most important asset, are delivering all of the above, as well as the active engagement with our transformation programme, and tomorrow sees a very important milestone, which is the completion of our consultation of staff. So a really important month in terms of moving forward, but our priorities, I hope, and our current issues are clear to the board. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much, June. I think, again, I continue to be impressed by the sheer scope and scale of the work that the agency does. And again, many thanks through you, June, to the entire staff of the agency for all the incredible work that they're doing. So thank you very much for that. Colleagues, any questions? Paul?
Yeah, I've got sort of several. I don't want to monopolise. I mean, the first one was really on the transformation programme and whether sort of assurance on supporting those staff who would be leaving in terms of their next steps and things. Do we have an alumni network? Do we do exit interviews? And just really wanting to support and look after our own.
Absolutely, and there's a whole range of support available, and there's a manager's toolkit, because it's clear that it's not just the senior staff, it's local management that need to be helping staff. Our commitment is in one-to-one for everyone. There's a standard procedure around any exit interview, but what we're seeing at the moment is the chance to support reskilling and retraining. So I hope you find that a sort of suitable assurance, and I can obviously provide more detail at any time if that would help.
Okay. We'll come back to the other questions, Paul, if that's okay. But Michael?
As ever, June, a very comprehensive paper. I'm very struck by all that the agency is doing. The demand for our services seems to be increasing all the time. So my question really is assurance around that we are sufficiently resilient going forward, that we have the skills, that we can continue to work at this pace.
Resilience is at the forefront of our executive committee's mind and the assurance committees that the executive committee has beneath it, especially our resource committee and our delivery and performance committee. It sounds a little formulaic, but we need that input at executive to be able to answer the questions around resilience. For example, a recent paper on winter pressures was given careful consideration at EXCO. We meet every Monday to take in a rugby scrum way all the things that are happening on the field, if I can put it that way. So it's a constant finger on the pulse. If you say, are we on top of things? We're watching very much what our customers tell us, and that's industry, including our generic sector, as well as the ILAP applicants. Because I think, as we hear, our concerned customers are our best source of learning. And so there's been a couple of approaches to me recently, one from the generic manufacturers and more recently around ILAP applicants, to be sure that we are putting the efforts in to those really important customer areas. As the nation worries about supply chains, and we know that I think it's the former CEO of Tesco who's over all that now, we too are making sure that supplies flow through whatever regulatory approvals that are needed.
Thank you for that assurance. Thank you.
And I think the balanced scorecard also provides some evidence in what's happening with some of the approvals, for example, in terms of the timelines in particular. Can I just ask colleagues, when we're asking questions, just to raise your voice, just make sure that members of the public can actually hear? Any other thoughts? Mercy?
Yeah, well, it's a great comprehensive report, as Michael has said, and we're doing such a wide-ranging kind of range of things. Just had a little bit to ask about the dermal fillers and the COVID vaccines. It was just that it's quite an interesting kind of sort of adverse reaction. And I just wanted to know how kind of these sort of adverse reactions are kind of put out into the public domain, really. I know GPs and vaccination centres obviously should know about this and should be kind of telling people, but I wonder if there are press releases, are people picking this up, because this was kind of a side effect that I wasn't aware of.
Absolutely, and that's the beauty of the yellow card scheme, that given all the exposure to these vaccines, we begin to pick up quite nuanced information, but nonetheless very important to those who are going to have their jab. And therefore we work with our comms division to produce materials and press releases, statements, and also with DHSC, because PHE, our public health teams, also provide important on-the-spot information. So again, it's a wide outreach, but we also follow up the impact of that outreach in terms of understanding and advice to people. An interesting discussion, I imagine, on the ground, but our important objective is to make sure that information is there, particularly as we look to younger people being encouraged to have their jab, and the advice is have that jab.
That's really useful. I mean,
Can I just build on that?
Yeah.
A question of my own, June. Could you just briefly explain how we're actually keeping healthcare professionals up to date? Because obviously when we have a safety issue for members of the public that might be watching, you know, how do we keep healthcare professionals updated when we have a safety concern?
We use similar outreach, but direct it via the particular learned societies. If it's a dermatological society, we would look to them to cascade to membership, British Association of Dermatologists in that case. So we try to work through the sources that are used and trusted. Having said that, we can do better, and I'm looking to, through our transformation, a better alignment of our risk communication with other forms of outreach. Of course, any health professional will read, you know, if you like, a journalistic or other things that will come to flow through anyway. And I think, again, it's about getting that outreach through whatever means. Journals may only come out every month, for example. So it's something that we're focused on. Our drug safety update needs to be rethought in the light of what health professionals want and need, particularly in their daily lives.
Okay. I was just going to comment that obviously that was just one example, but that whole thing about communication, and certainly in our committee we are looking at some of those new strategies that we're going to work with health professionals.
I think that's really important, Mercy, helping to join the system up. You know, that was again one of Baroness Cumberledge's observations about the fragmented health system. And so I think we can't solve it all ourselves, but I think we've got a role to make sure we communicate through as many channels as we can. That's great. Mandy, you had a question, and I'll come to you, Graham.
Yes, a couple of things. There seem to be quite a few new services coming through, which is really good, the sort of for the new agency with clinical trials, with devices. And I was just going to ask how those new services have been integrated into the transformation programme and the resource implications for those, either skills or numbers of people in those new teams.
Thank you, Mandy. Through you, Chair, it's been a really active discussion, because with transformation we have the opportunity to build new teams and skill them for new work and new services. We're working across the piece. At the last board we talked about, I took a punt and said about 22 or thereabouts. I think it's a bit more than that, but all our areas are being looked at for the value add and new areas of service need. So it's happening at this moment, and I hope that the Organisational Development and Remuneration Committee on the 1st of November will be able to get an overview of how that's being put together. What's the value add? What's the service? What cost recovery is needed? And the volumes that are likely. Difficult to predict, but if we're keeping our eyes and ears open, is it a surprise that ILAP, for example, the Innovation Passport, is a success? Not really. We could have predicted that. So I think that we need to be a bit more astute about the areas we put our efforts into, and we'll look to your committee, Mandy, to help us with that.
Okay, that's it. Excellent, thank you.
Graham, I'll probably come to you, and then I'll come to you, Jane.
Thanks. I mean, a tremendous range of stuff has been noted. Just to pick up on one that we might come back to later about CPRD. So you've talked about expanding the scope of CPRD. Can you just comment a little bit on how far it reaches now in terms of GP practices, and with the ambition for geographic coverage, where are the gaps and what's the ambition there?
25% of GP practices, good geographic coverage, and it's one of the great assets of this data set that there is good diversity. But we can always do better, and areas that we're looking to do better in include improving use of the data to drive up awareness and hence use. So you'll hear later on in the paper about clinical trials, how that will work there. We want this tremendous asset to be maximally used for public benefit. There is going to be an important report by Professor Ben Goldacre very soon that will enable us to really focus on the value of this research environment to maximise, as you say, imply how much we get coverage and how well it's used.
Okay, Junaid. June, my thanks to you and the agency for performing and transforming at the same time. It sounds like it's a tremendous amount of work. My question to you is related to the ILAP, the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, and also Project Orbis. It sounds like the international collaborations that the agency is forming are really, really critical, and there's a close relationship with the FDA in particular. Are we looking to do two things? One is, if this is now innovative licensing and access, does that encourage us to review all of our processes and say, what are we going to stop in other aspects of the work of the agency to be innovative across everything that we do, not just for this particular pathway? And are we also looking to build international collaborations with other groups in addition to the FDA?
Well, thank you. I think, Chair, there's two sides of that. Yes, this is our torchbearer, this is our flagship project, and in fact should be the prototype that enables us to look at all areas of work that are integrated in the NHS and NICE and so forth. So it's the concept that has been pioneered for the innovative products, but I think as we look at repurposed medicines, for example, we can, and devices of course, as the board advised, we can expand it. In terms of other areas of collaboration, just so happens yesterday a very helpful teleconference, one of our regular conferences with Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland, and that is important because it is true work sharing. There are two innovative products coming through that will be five-way work sharing. Now, that's something to get excited about and to develop further. The attraction for the UK of a larger market is clear to all of us. So, very active, and I think FDA for specialists at the moment work around cancer, possibly other things, I hope clinical trials, but Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland for the general work sharing that we can expand. It takes into account biosimilars, generics, and in fact, as we've just stood down complementary a bit because that work was steady state and we can pull back there, but we can have growth areas in other areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really important, Junaid, just give you some context. You know, over the last year we've been talking around how it's not just about transforming the organisation, we need to transform some of our processes. You know, and ILAP is a good example of that, and we've talked a number of times now how we can expand the ILAP concept to almost become the standard way forward, and devices is definitely part of that particular discussion. So that's part of the transformation that's ongoing as well. So we need to look at efficiency, how we get new products to market most quickly and safely. So that's always going to be the watchword in all of that. Thank you. Hey there.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to build on Graham's question around CPRD. I was absolutely delighted to see that TPP is now on board and that's enabled more data to flow through. I was wondering, given that I think it's 1 in 5 GP practices currently supply anonymized data, or 25% maybe. What do we need to do to reassure the GP practices that aren't participating, and now pretty much everyone can participate, either themselves or the public? How can we reassure them more that the data is safely managed so that we can enable even more data to flow through from those?
Well, this is a really important question for us at this moment, and I already referred to Ben Goldacre's report, which will be coming out in the next weeks, that will look hard at how people can feel very comfortable about the protections that are applied so their data can be fully used. So we believe up to now we've had a very good system, but we can always do better and make sure that everyone has not a slightest worry about how their data are handled and managed.
It's probably also important just to point out, again, for members of the public, that the 25% of data that we do hold is anonymised. So there is no way of actually looking at individual patients' names with the records. But having the ability to see how treatments have progressed over a number of years, in fact a lifetime, that type of data is really valuable from a research perspective. But it's absolutely anonymised and kept completely safe. Graham, you want to come back in on that?
I think maybe when we come back later to the discussion, because it's relevant to the trials access, and I think particularly understanding where the gaps are will be helpful because of the agenda around ensuring everybody can get into trials. And I think this could be an important gateway for that.
Yeah, I think it is. So I've got some questions on diversification myself, I think, to be fair. So.
But also I think the issue of trust is obviously critical, and understanding the patient engagement in those processes I think is going to be important.
Crucial. Absolutely crucial. Okay, well let's pick that back up in Mark's paper. Paul, I know you had more than one question. Do you want to...
well, it's related to Junaid's question, really. I think access and Orbis are really important, and I wonder, do we have a strategy, or does Access have a strategy to expand its reach, bring in other countries and other areas?
At the moment, the access strategy, which we published 2 or 3 months ago, relates to the nature of its work, moving more to a life cycle approach and integration with health technology assessment. So it's been about expanding and improving what it does with the 5. But you're quite right to ask what next, and I think it would take some careful decision making, but clearly Japan might be in sight. There might be countries more towards the Australia side of the world that we might think about. But at the moment, the strategy, and I'll be glad to send you the link to it, is focusing on really strengthening what access does together. It has been a success story for new active substances. I think about 32 have been through, but there's more to do in other areas, and that's where we're putting our efforts in. Not forgetting, though, that when we're looking at perhaps cell and gene therapies, that's an important growth area. There's been some new pipeline work with some major companies that is helping the Access Consortium consider how best to offer that service. But more countries, why not?
Okay, so the principle, yes. Raj, you want to come in. Was this on the same point, or was it a different point?
Slightly different point, building on the international collaboration that June talked about. I think it's incredibly important that we continue to hold our own on the international platform. Even more so now than before, just because of where we are in terms of being outside the EU. Because that will inspire both confidence in the country, nationally, as well as confidence outside the country. That would help on multiple aspects in terms of trade and all of those areas. But one key question that I thought, June, from the agency perspective, is that you said you'll be sharing among the 5 countries processes, and I'm assuming that their common products can come through and you will share work.
That's correct.
Between the 5. I do see an opportunity here, and it might be implicit already in what you said. If you're sharing the processes, safety would be a very huge area where you should be able to draw on each other with the right bilaterals or multilaterals in place for confidentiality. Because that will then give us something back in return, where we can look at early signal detection earlier than later, in terms of patient accrual. Is that in scope? Because I see that as a big win, both for the countries but also for ourselves.
The focus up to now has been on access, but you're absolutely right, more consideration to safety would strengthen the concept of early access. After all, if the systems are robust, there's greater confidence and trust. Up to now, we've been working bilaterally with Australia and Health Canada as needed, but I do agree that we could look much further at a more coordinated approach, and we'll take that forward.
I think the two things go together very well, actually, don't they? Because I think it is absolutely possible to have earlier access to new medicines, but I think the trade-off has got to be more stringent safety monitoring, or risk proportionate safety monitoring, depending on the product that's involved.
Absolutely.
So I think that works. Paul, you want to have the final question? You've done the preparation. I want to give you the chance.
Something which isn't in the report, but sort of it could have been, and it's around a recall from Philips on CPAP machines. And I think it highlights the importance of the work that we're doing in terms of bridging to other healthcare groups and thinking about the whole ecosystem, because this was, I think, millions of devices worldwide were recalled because of an issue. And it's just thinking through the knock-on effects of then respiratory physicians having to focus on this at a time when there's a lot of pressure in the system for ventilation support because of COVID.
Yes. We're actually taking stock, Chair, of how we handle recalls and how we communicate and manage them. We work closely with DHSC, obviously, around local perhaps supply issues that need to be alternatives. But I think the system as it stands is a bit clunky and may leave areas that could be strengthened. I'm thinking particularly on 2 recalls last week. There's a running issue with nitrosamine or similar entities, impurities in medicines. So more could be done in that space, and we'll be focusing on that.
Okay. Sally, you have a question.
I believe we have a question in from Catherine at DHSC. I don't have it in front of me, but Natalie may have it.
Yeah, she's got a couple of questions. The first one, actually, sorry, anonymous paper. I've done that later papers.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Well, there we go then. Catherine, we will ask you a question shortly.
Apologies.
Okay, right.
I think just before we close on that, I think Paul's point's really important about this joining up, not just on recalls, because I'm just thinking about the PCR testing labs which have been in the news and how that relates, because the tests are medical devices, but the importance of the laboratory validation and everything that goes around that is what eventually impacts on patient safety. And our role around that, we talked about it with medicines in terms of the importance of the healthcare professionals, and we would inspect a manufacturing plant. But for a device such as those tests, we don't. And there's a gap. So I think really it's quite important to understand how the pieces fit together and where our role is. And I think that builds on what you were saying, Paul, because it's the patient at the end of the day doesn't see, all of the things that go on.
It's a really important point, and Chair and I were talking about that, Stephen and I were talking about that just before the meeting, and that's a good example of what is the issue and who is accountable. A local laboratory, the Health Security Agency, the MHRA, and depending on the cause, it could be any of. And meanwhile, the public want to know that it's been sorted. So I think in the area of in vitro diagnostics, we've got work to do, and on the positive side, we're building tremendously proactive and helpful relationships with the new UK Health Security Agency. So it very much is in sight, what Mandy's talked about. Yeah. We have to have join up.
Yeah, and this could also fit in with the public consultation that's going on with devices as well, June.
I hope it will come out through that, and the recognition globally that in vitro diagnostics have not had the attention, the regulatory frameworks have not had the input that they need. So.
Yeah, I think COVID has definitely demonstrated the importance of diagnostics more than from a public perspective than ever before. But it's quite clear that with new medicines going forward, that's going to be really critical that we make sure the diagnostic components are appropriately regulated. Okay, I think we'll need to probably draw that really interesting conversation to a close there, June. But again, I think it's quite clear there's a huge amount of going on within the agency. Performing and transforming, I think, as Junaid described it. But I think certainly, please express thanks from the board to all the staff in the agency for the work that they're doing. And let's just keep working our way through all of these issues. That being the case, it's probably a good time to move on to talking about performance. So if we move to page number 19, about current performance of the MHRA and the balanced scorecard. John, you can assume that we've read it, but are there any sort of key points you want to bring to our attention? And we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Chair. Just probably for members of the public that are joining the board for the first time, just some quick context. So we've been developing the balanced scorecard for several months now. We took a decision to start using it with a view to making another iteration of improvements and modifications from November. The segments relate the 6 areas of our delivery plan rather than the 4 segments of a traditional balanced scorecard, but we believe that's appropriate for what we want. November's developments will see various productivity indices being inserted as well, which we would expect to kind of evolve over time. That may well promote further discussion. The key highlights are in the paper. Section 3.2 on page 21 has some of the healthcare access side of things that the board's already been looking at. So we may want to have a look at some of those. But over to the board for questions and comments.
Okay, colleagues, who wants to kick us off? Michael.
Inevitably, Chair, I look at finance. So
you look at finance.
Can I start with that? And I benefit from John and I having some discussion a few weeks ago. I suppose the one thing that I would highlight is our spending plans are probably moving a little bit to the right, really. And
can you translate that for members of the public?
Sorry, yeah. What I should be saying is I think that we still have a degree of optimism bias in our spending assumptions, and I don't think we will spend all the money that we anticipated we would spend in this financial year. So I think what that means is it has consequences for the next financial year. So my question is how are we managing that? Because we have a bid going into the public expenditure settlement that's underway at the moment for transitional funding. I don't know, John, are we reflecting that within there? Or because otherwise, Stephen, I expect what I'm concerned about is that we could have a bigger deficit in the next financial year than we'd anticipated, and how are we going to fund that? That would be my issue.
So, John, do you want to comment?
Happy to come back on that, Chair. So at the risk of getting over technical, we actually do already adjust for optimism bias in the numbers and reforecast to start with. We've done analysis of our project spend over the last 2 or 3 years, and we're around the kind of 34-36% level, which sounds a lot, but actually by government standards is relatively low. So we take a view on those project numbers. So that's a major sensitivity when we're looking at our reforecast. The Executive Committee looked last week, actually, on our revised reforecast to the end of the year, and we'll be bringing that to the Audit and Risk Committee in November. We concluded, actually, that there was scope for additional spending. So what the Executive Committee decided was that actually the Resources Committee, which I chair, would consider additional requests for further spend this year to utilise our reserves. That still needs to demonstrate value for money and all the other tests, etc. But we put that in place. We met for the first time yesterday and approved 3 or 4 additional extra items, and we're going to meet weekly going forward. What the Executive Committee will also see next week or later this week is a revised 3-year forecast. That will show, as we know, that we need additional support next year because we anticipate still significant project-related, primarily IT expenditure next year, and before we have the chance to implement a new fees model. So Michael is totally correct that actually we do need support in the spending review for next year for a financial perspective, because what that 3-year forecast will show is we will be in significant deficit next year. We'll have reduced a lot of our staffing costs, but before the fees come in, there'll be a cap, and we still need to make those IT investments. And again, we'll be sharing that 3-year forecast at Audit and Risk Committee. Sorry, long answer, Michael. But
No, a valid answer though, John. And I think also, if we don't get the funding that we want from or would ideally want from the spending review, what about contingency planning?
We will have to make some quite severe... So primarily we'll have to look at that project spend, the IT, and make some quite tough calls, in all honesty.
Okay, so I think it's going to continue to be monitored, and Michael, I think your committee will have a role in that?
Yeah, and I would come back on the one area that still worries me is the IT spend. You know, to be constructively challenging, we have been here for some time now. You and I don't think we have the benefit of time on our side by any means. This needs to be an absolute priority.
And just thinking, we're obviously recruiting a new Chief Technology Officer, June, and I believe Claire will be starting within a month, I think.
At the end of the month, yeah.
Have we got the resource in the IT team, John, do you think, to be able to deliver the programmes of technology improvement that we need?
So in that plan, they have looked at resourcing, and the belief is that yes, we do have what we need to put in place. There is a bit of a link, which is, again, most of the board will know, in parallel, we are retendering our long-term application outsourcing contract. That's expected to conclude in November. We have a number of credible bidders, but there is a bit of constructive tension in that in an ideal world, we wouldn't want to be giving significant new application development. We would prefer to give it to the new provider. So we need to manage that tension, I think. And clearly also there's a requirement on the transformation side to articulate the requirements for the CIO and the team to actually be able to specify and build those applications. So there are a number of dependencies.
Yeah, no, it's a complex picture, there's no doubt about that. But I think certainly the transformation that we talked about earlier, June's report, is going to be very dependent on technology. So I don't think we can emphasise enough the critical nature of being able to deliver the technology roadmap. And I think we may well come back to that in the risk paper that's later on as well. Other comments or questions? Paul?
Yeah, it's on the clinical trials bit. I mean, the charts are quite hard to interpret because they're over such a short time period, and really wanted to see what the pattern is over years and a moving average, really. And so I'd like to get a better understanding of the view of how competitive we are, because when I talk to people in industry, what they tell me is that we're not very competitive, that this is, as a country rather than just MHRA, and this is where I think the whole ecosystem of it comes in, that we're relatively expensive, slow to start up, and that we're losing business to overseas countries. I think the sprint stuff we're going to come on to will be really important in addressing this, but in terms of metrics, maybe we want to look more broadly.
I think it's a valid challenge that probably more long-term data would be relevant, because clinical trials have been suppressed actually during the pandemic for a period of time. There was no recruitment, etc., going on, so it's a slightly false comparison, I think. So perhaps Mark and I need to work on more long-term trends of that. I think you're spot on, Paul, which is if sprint is successful and we can dramatically shorten that kind of identification and recruitment phase, potentially I think Mark and Alison will be finding we've got a very attractive product in that area, but we'll come on to that later in the board.
Yeah, I think we probably need to split the conversation, Paul, would be my view, because I think there's an element of needing to manage the in-year performance, which is really largely what the balanced scorecard is about, and that's why getting the right targets and the right outcome measures becomes important. And then there's the strategic discussion particularly around how we link the competitiveness of the UK together. And just to give you some assurance, June, we were talking to the Health Research Authority just a couple of weeks ago, and this very, very topic came up in conversation.
Absolutely, and we're taking quite a comprehensive look at the legal framework, because we can enable trials, particularly start-up, if we get things right, get it speedily through to start-up. So it's currently underway, but perhaps we can use the board interest to make sure that we're getting this right. We'll be putting through legal amendments by early next year.
Because in some ways, for me, one of the success measures around clinical trials is not necessarily the number that have actually been have come in and we've actually approved. It's actually the time for approval, because that becomes the quite crucial differentiator from an international perspective. And Graham, as a principal investigator, I guess you'd have a view in terms of the competitiveness of the UK versus other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on the main issues, but I agree. I mean, I think it's the time to set up that's the key thing. That's what a lot of, particularly commercial trials, will look at, but I think all people. So, but it is a complex process if this is one part of it. So looking at across the piece.
And what we've been doing with the Health Research Authority, as colleagues know, is we're working on having the combined ways of working, so that we're doing the parallel ethics approval with the regulatory approval. That's one component, a single system to achieve that. And then it's a case of how we can then think about maybe funding routes, how that can be all sort of aligned. And then it's back to Mark's paper we'll talk about shortly about speeding up patient recruitment, because I think that's a key UK competitiveness issue, and actually all the other tools that we can provide to help that, as well as different types of trial design as well, because that's another differentiator for the UK. So I think there's two or three things going on here, Paul, but I think you're right to make the challenge. Does this really tell us what's going on in clinical trials? And I'm with you, I'm not sure counting the numbers is very helpful. It's more about what is the outcome we're trying to achieve, which is faster trial approval, I think. Okay. Colleagues, any other? Mercy?
I always struggle with the graphics to understand them, so this is my own personal trying to understand it all. So the commentary is really useful for me, so thanks for that. I just wanted to pick up your comment under 3.3 under patient safety and the adverse drug reactions, which is normal levels of ADRs around 3,000 per month. And it may take significant time to return to those levels. Why do we want to return to those levels? Because I think greater reporting is kind of what we're wanting to achieve. And I think COVID, the vaccines has kind of really upped the profile around yellow card reporting, which is, you know, ably demonstrated. And we want to kind of keep that level in all drugs, and certainly in detecting early sort of signals of safety. And I just wondered why, you know, kind of we want to return to 3,000.
That's probably unfortunate phrasing, I think, and Alison may want to come in on this, but, you know, at the end of the day, Safety Connect is all about dealing with, hopefully, significantly increased volumes in a far more effective manner. So yes, I think we'd agree with you. Alison?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think it is somewhat unfortunate phrasing. No, absolutely, we want to maintain and increase the level of reporting because that enables us to detect signals better and faster.
Yeah, certainly in my NHS work, open reporting is seen as a really positive thing to do. So the more reports of potential serious incidents in NHS terminology is really important. So we need to be thinking about how we maintain hundreds of thousands of potential signals and reports so we can actually make sure that patients are kept safe in this country and elsewhere. Okay.
Safety Connect should really support us there and really enabling greater reporting from all branches of healthcare professionals.
So despite the graph, you can show you were at least reading and understanding. Carly, I think you've got a question.
Yes, a question from Catherine Glover at Department of Health and Social Care. Catherine is asking if it would be possible to have more detail on the recovery plan for generics licensing.
John, you got any information you could provide on that?
Not personally, no. I think we might need to come back on that. So on generics.
June, any observations?
I suspect this relates to the letter I mentioned earlier from the British generic manufacturers. An immediate check of our overall performance hasn't shown a deviation. However, we know that within that there are one or two areas. I mentioned the nitrosamine issue that's been long-standing in the EU, and there may be others. So what we're doing is to explore in detail more granular aspects of that overall picture. We also know that there are issues around approval for wholesalers. So it's about diving into some of the overall picture you see there to find out exactly where the issues are.
Yeah. I think looking at the commentary on the generic section, it's quite clear that, you know, the timescales are equivalent to Europe, but quite frankly, as a sovereign progressive regulator, we should be aspiring to be quicker than Europe.
Exactly.
You know, and so actually, I welcome the letter from the BGMA, and actually, I believe, June, in the next month, we've got a meeting actually with them as well, where I hope we can start to talk about these are the steps that we're taking to become risk proportionate and how we can accelerate access to new generic medicines, because also, from an NHS perspective, that's also crucially important in terms of managing the medicines budget. Let's be honest.
Yeah, and raised it at the Access meeting with Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland, and we were absolutely united yesterday. There had been a push, in fact it's one of those things that perfection may take time, the push to extend generic timeframes in access, and we pushed right back. Yeah. So this should be you know what's coming, or you can well identify any particular questions. It should be a very speedy and smooth process, and it is our chance to be the most attractive place for the first generic to become available.
And again, John, I think as you're sort of thinking about the update of the balanced scorecard, you know, again, it strikes me with a number of the healthcare access issues here. It's not the number of applications that matter; it's the time that it takes. You know, and I think this is where, you know, we went into the balanced scorecard with our eyes open, and we asked to say, let's just present what the information that you've got. But we always knew this would need to iterate and would need to evolve. And this is the difference between just counting inputs and counting the outputs. And that's just a classic example. I know it's difficult. It won't necessarily be done immediately for the next month. But I think that should be the mindset. That's certainly what I put in mind, if that works.
Sure. I mean, we actually do have that data, and we look at it every month. The question actually is somewhat around volume, that's the subject of an hour meeting every month, and 40 or 50 charts. So it's kind of which chart almost that we'll look into.
Okay. Right.
I think in the context of clinical trials, there's the volume, there is the time, but quality of review is also really important. I think the three need to come in together. That's when you really get success. Making sure you're asking meaningful questions in the context to the applicants, because often if you're on the other side from an industry perspective, you do it fast and you get 300 questions. Okay? That kind of defeats the purpose, because it takes them longer then to go and answer that, and often you might see the answers in the questions. So I'm not saying the agency doesn't do quality review, June. I'm just saying it's those three elements have to come together. So managing the volume, doing it fast, but maintaining quality as you do the review and asking pertinent and critical questions.
Well, I would like to say our clinical trials unit absolutely follows that philosophy, to add value and to interact in a precise way and speedily. And I think clearly they showed what they could do, for example, with the recovery trial, etc. And the recent data from the US FDA, following a review of all the COVID trials, that 4% had actionable data. That's not the UK. No, 4% was something to worry about. But on this side, trials like recovery have shown the world what can be done when the NHS responds. So, I'd like the board to be assured that our clinical trials unit absolutely takes the philosophy that Raj has talked about. Time, volume and precision of questions to deliver actionable data.
Graham, you're looking very thoughtful.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to interpret your facial expression. This is the benefit of a face-to-face meeting.
Nothing to add.
Okay.
That's what I understood.
So, all right. I think the board's been asked on this paper is to review the metrics and the commentary, which I think is what we've been doing, and before considering whether this provides sufficient assurance that the current performance of the agency is on track and aligned to our strategic objectives. So I think we're already talking as a board that actually there's maybe these metrics need to evolve, and that was in part of your opening comment, John. So I think we've got some assurance. I think he's speaking personally, but I think on behalf of other members too. And I think actually as we evolve this report to include more of the outcome measures, I think we'll be able to get a higher level of assurance than we currently have. But certainly I think it's very clear that we're working on the 6 domains. It's completely aligned to our strategy. So I think it's trying to get the right measures and the right level of detail. But again, I would see the challenge and the discussions as positive, not as a negative. If that's okay with everybody. So let's note the report with thanks, and we'll look forward to the next iteration next month, please. Okay, we've talked about clinical trials a couple of times now already. So page 31, we've got the paper on how is the MHRA accelerating the approval and diversification of patient recruitment for clinical trials. Mark, you can assume that we've read the paper, but do you want to make any sort of opening remarks, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we actually covered a lot of my opening remarks in the preceding discussion. The board has heard about all the work the agency has done to date to accelerate approvals, but as we've just said, approvals is only part of the entire ecosystem, and we've got to look to see very much what else we can do on setting up the trials in order to meet the government's drive to be one of the most attractive places in the world for clinical trials. So the paper discusses some of the mechanisms that the agency is looking at. In particular, we're talking about the work by the Clinical Practice Research Data Link and their new tools they've developed, Sprint trials, which are now under pilot. There's also a discussion of how we're working with partners to try and influence the entire ecosystem. Now, what I'm hoping today from the board is some suggestions on what gets in there, and also further suggestions for what else can we do, and how might we trying to prioritise so that to make the UK the best ecosystem it can be. So thank you, Chair.
Okay, so I think actually there's the 2 points, aren't there, really? So it's around actually asking for our guidance on priorities for the initiatives, that just so we're really clear, what are the areas that we need to spend more time on, or any other input we can provide. And the second is actually about using CPRD to identify opportunities to support and promote, and enable patient recruitment. So let's stick with the big picture first. So in terms of, let's think about the priorities that Mark has identified here in terms of accelerating international recruitment. Does this feel about right, or are there other initiatives that we could or should be adopting to accelerate patient recruitment into trials? Paul?
I think this is so important. It's a fantastic paper. I've got so many comments. I'll need a separate session with you. I think it really addresses fairness of access, because at the minute, the patient who lives close to a research active centre, a tertiary hospital, who's seen by a research recruiting clinician will get access to excellent care. But if you're in a DGH, a non-research active clinician, you miss out, and this addresses that. However, it's unfair for the 3/4 of patients who are not, their GP is not signed up to CPRD. That's unfair. So if I'm one of those patients, can I request that, no, I do want to be told about any clinical trial for which I might be eligible? Is that a way in which we can leverage in some of these reluctant GPs to sign up?
Well, absolutely. I don't know, Alison, if you want to talk a little about CPRD's work on recruitment.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's very exciting, the Sprint model, because of the ability to do that feasibility count, and as we increase the scope of CPRD, as we bring on more practices, which requires an infrastructure and an interventional research service platform that can cope with the capability and the capacity for analytics. But as we do that and develop that further, we'll have a greater population to select from. And it's really, really important. This feasibility count that CPRD does is totally unique, actually, because it enables that first pass through. And actually, I have some figures in front of me here on one trial, one feasibility count that they did. Started obviously with 16 million patients. It was an MI trial. First inclusion was male, females over 40 years, took it down to 7.5 million. Then you need a diagnosis of class 4, 2 to 4 heart failure, took it down to 123. And then with a couple of other exclusions, takes it down to 112,000, which is still a huge pool to select from, but you can see why increasing the scope and reach of CPRD will enable us to increase that geographical reach and enable patients to be recruited into trials. I just want to say the other unique feature about Sprint is the ability to interact with the GP and modify exclusion criteria. There's been one example where a GP fed back and said, well, that excludes all my patients, that one exclusion criteria. So actually that interaction back with the clinical trial team enables you to expand the scope of the possible patients who would be enabled to be invited into the trial. So I think, how do we do it better? Increasing the number of practices bringing in those TPP practices that we talked about, enabling an analytical platform that can cope with it, and then continuing to expand that feasibility count, which within 10 days is still the fastest, I think, of any option within the UK today, and probably globally, actually. That's a really fast return.
And I come back to Paul's point around practically in the short term, allowing people to opt in regardless of their GP
I
practice?
think that's difficult because the case finding is through the CPRD practice, rather that particular routine is by the case finding ability of the CPRD database.
But it's opting in to just be told about take future trials.
Yeah, so
it's equivalent to
communications, I think, is probably the key there, enabling GPs to be aware of this as an option if their practice signs up to the CPRD database.
Okay. So I'm sure we'll come back to this in due course, but that certainly sounds like there's an active view to try and increase the coverage of CPRD as a core use. Graham?
Can I just pick up on the coverage question? So we touched on it earlier, but with the TPP coming on board, that 25% goes up further, or is that including TPP? And I suppose my question is, more is obviously good.
25% now.
Yes.
So what does TPP take you to?
I think that is, I would have to check exactly what.
It's quite,
Yes, I think it's, yes, a large number of the remaining
I
practices.
suppose my question is broader, more is good, but are you measuring where you're getting your new practices? Because clearly there's an agenda around rural communities, coastal communities, and do you have prioritisation for those kind of practices where you might actually be helping to address imbalances by recruiting preferentially?
We certainly know where the practices are. In this early stage with that, we've probably not looked at prioritisation by geography. So the two pilots are looking very much prioritisation by the medical condition.
So I don't know, this is theoretical, but my concern would be you end up preferentially recruiting practices in wealthy areas near hospitals that are recruiting anyway. And so that's good, you'll get trial activity, but you won't necessarily help address imbalance. If you measured it a bit more, it might help.
Yeah. I'll ask you to come back.
They're certainly prioritising the recruitment of practices where their coverage is currently low, so that's a strategic aim. And in fact, the scope of CPRD is geographically wide already, and they're looking to recruit practices where their coverage is lower.
John, you want to come in?
Just to follow up on Graham's point, so I think one of the positive aspects of finally, after an extended period, getting TPP on board is that actually it does fill in some of the geographic, not gaps, but actually lesser well-represented areas, particularly in the northeast, etc. So if you map that GP provider coverage, which we do, that's a very helpful input.
But it needs to be much more than geography. It also needs to be, all of the characteristics of patients, doesn't it, as well? So, Junaid, I'll come to you.
So I'll speak a little bit with my GP hat, which I think is massive heterogeneity in my general practice around the individual practice partners, or indeed now the heterogeneity around what's the role of a PCN, so a primary care network, or indeed, I think longer term with the ICSs, around what can you do at scale. So one thing that we've seen during the pandemic is the role of primary care networks, thinking about general practice at scale, where you have different GPIT system suppliers, maybe EMIS or TPP or others. Having access through TPP is one thing, then having the consent of a practice to onboard is the other thing, and then having the confidence of practitioners to say, we understand what it means for our patients to be registered on a trial is probably a third bit. So I think what we should probably think about, and Alice and I spoke about this briefly last time we caught up, is playing out that whole movie, as it were. So actually, what's the things that are limiting practitioners from feeling confident in engaging and having that conversation? When we already know there's a massive access challenge just to see patients day-to-day, face-to-face in general practice today. So increasing demands on general practice make it easier for them to say no, as opposed to how do we make it easy for you to say yes? And so that's probably one thought I had. And I think if we could start thinking about other constructs such as PCNs or ICSs, and how do we engage with them at a system level, what could we do over time? Because this turns into a massive real-world evidence database. So if I'm thinking about trial recruitment and I'm thinking about phase 4 and then phase X trials, how do I think about the whole value proposition that MHRA and the UK government bring, not just around recruitment of heterogeneous patients, but then understanding the real-world implications of these drugs, and how do we map that out in primary care? But over time, do we also have a role to think about what we do with EPIC and Cerner and joining up the secondary care side as a true clinical practice database system, not just primary care?
Because that's got to be another development moving out into primary care as well. If only we knew someone in an integrated care board. Maybe we could run a pilot, couldn't we? If only. So, but Raj, I know you were trying to come in.
Jeanette touched on this. Clearly not having more GPs signing up to this, we need to better understand the deterrence. it's timed clearly in terms of what's been said, and I think that's probably a major one. But if we can comprehensively understand, even do a little survey with them, something around understand, there might be some low-hanging fruit that you can really mitigate some of that and make it a bit more attractive in terms of getting them on board, either through technology or process or, just look at it. We can't do it, then that's it, but at least we should try. Because
well, TPP was definitely part of that, because there were, from memory, 35–40% of the entire GP systems in the country were excluded from us until we brought them on board. So that's a big chunk.
So same spirit, really. Target the next level and see what is it that's holding them back, and is there anything we can do, without boiling the ocean, so to speak.
Exactly.
The second piece is slightly different. It's taking a two-pronged approach to this. If patients are made more aware of this, so I think it was touched on earlier, as a comm strategy, it's part of our comm strategy and the value it brings, because then patients can reach out to GPs themselves and put some of that ask in. So there's enough community of patients reaching out to a specific practice, it might sway them to say, hey, the need is bigger here than we think. So I'm thinking two-pronged approach. The customers, who are the patients, get them motivated and see, let them have a say. And then on the other hand, in terms of the users of this, folks who input were the GPs to get it in. Because without tackling it in both directions, you might miss an opportunity here, to take it.
Yes, Mandy.
Yeah, sort of building on that point about GPs, and we hear in the news, and you know firsthand, Junaid, how busy GPs are. And what other incentives? Do we have to do some sort of financial incentive? Is that something we have to really think about? And I think there's a huge education piece as well for GPs as well as patients in terms of the benefits of that. Because in some of the poorer areas, the patient advocacy is probably going to be lower, realistically. So I really think about the effort to educate, and maybe it's something we have to ask for funding. This has to be a key part of the UK becoming a good place to do clinical trials.
It's definitely an environmental issue that there isn't. I think that's the point you're making.
Maybe I can just come back on a few of those points that would be helpful. So first of all, generally when CPRD contact GPs, they're very happy to sign up. They're not reluctant. It's just a case of bringing them on board, and there's a large number already in the queue, so we need to make sure the infrastructure is there to enable that. And they're very keen to sign up in general. There is this very interesting quality report that the CPRD do to go back to the GPs, informing them where potentially there are patients who aren't followed according to clinical guidelines, or there's prescribing issues, so there is that really nice feedback, which I think is very helpful for GPs. And also they're keen to take part in the clinical studies. There is no real issue in incentivising GPs to do that. It's just a case of getting around all the GPs and getting them signed up to the process. And there's a large number actually in the queue to be signed up currently. So I think it's a very effective process. Obviously, the more we can scale that, the better. But currently, the GP population that is signed up to CPRD is representative of the UK population.
And that's really important to hear. So, Graham, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to separate the signing up to CPRD from the engagement in trials, which may or may not be representative. And I think there was a bit missing here for me about understanding the GP perspective, which I think has been touched on well. And some things we haven't mentioned are the confidence of GPs in how trials are being selected to come to them, and the transparency of that process, the patient engagement in that. And I think that's something I've heard, certainly anecdotally, and I don't know if it's widespread. But also, many practices are having to make decisions individually. And I think that the question about federation or some sort of group which can make decisions that streamlines that process is helpful. And it gives confidence in going to patients to say, yes, this has been through a process that people have signed up to.
With confidence is also scale, because you get to a bigger number of potential patients as well, which I think is important. Hayley, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to echo some of the things that have been said, I mean, I think to really improve the service, we've got to aim for 100% coverage. Yeah. That's, and that would address, we'd still need to prioritise which ones come on first, but, that should be the aim, is that we get all GP practices. And then in terms of depth of data and a longitudinal view of that data, we talked about Epic and some of the other software suppliers, Q-Trust. But perhaps the population health systems that are going to be deployed in ICS should also be one of the next target groups. I'm not sure why we're restricting it, if we are, to GP practices.
Yeah, it's just how the system was built up as a GP practice data link to start with, and it's evolved, but it's got to be broader than that to provide truly representative end-to-end patient data, I think. But, I'm just conscious of time, but we've talked a lot about CPRD. There's a lot else in the paper around how we accelerate clinical trials beyond CPRD, and I just want to make sure we don't miss that, because historically we know that even gender was not necessarily equally represented in clinical trials. So can I just ask if the board can identify any other opportunities for increasing either the speed of the clinical trial process, but also the diversification of that process? Mandy?
So one of the things that was section 5.3, I know it's about ILAP, but the real-world evidence and designing trials and getting the tool to do that. I think companies are really struggling with that, around how they spend their money wisely to get quality data. So I think any help that can be done to see what that tool will be, even if it's not perfect, could help accelerate the quality of real-world evidence that we get.
If companies are looking to do something that's really quite different, is that more of an innovation dialogue that we need to be having, rather than necessarily this is the process, make it fit?
Well, it varies obviously from the size of the company and how much resources they have, but if you're looking at smaller companies, they don't have those resources, they will look for guidance in terms of what that means, because, well, it's not, the clinical trial itself is very expensive, and then we're asking for the real world evidence, and it's like, I could generate this evidence, it might be meaningless. So I think we need to guide a little bit there to get that more.
Mark, is it worth just saying a few words around the innovation accelerator in the new transformed organisation that we're putting together? Because do you think that might be part of the solution to that?
It certainly will, could be. So the innovation, at the moment, we have the technology office, which deals with technical inquiries, but it doesn't address some of the things you've just raised, which is about effectively a deeper relationship and more supportive. It tends to be more of a Q&A machine. That's a bit unfair, but it's certainly criticism made of it. So we're looking really to start thinking about, well, how do we do that? And we're talking there about how we actually take the advice and structure it to actually have a greater relationship with the organisations asking advice. So we're offering more, effectively a wider service. It may be end-to-end along the product life cycle, or it might be greater depth in terms of the answers they're getting in one particular part of it. So you've just said, well, effectively you're talking about, well, how can we additionally guide a smaller company? That's exactly what the Innovation Accelerator needs to explore how we can do that. Now, there will be effectively issues we have to address between specific company requests and generic guidance which benefits all. So we're at the start of progress on that, but as Stephen said, it is the hope that we're basically deepening the way we're engaging with the people who are asking us.
I think that's going to be quite important.
Very, very important. I think regulators are seen as a bit scary by people won't necessarily reach out.
But we also need to say we're not the FDA. We are approaching. Right, you've got a lot of experience with regulators.
RWD, real-world data, I think it's a relatively new concept. We forget it because there's the years of experience on clinical trial applications and what I call the normative route. But Mandy raises a really good point, particularly for the smaller companies. The big companies who go out there and get others to do it and figure out how to do it because they got the resource. But the SMEs will struggle because as a concept in development, it is a relatively new concept, overall. Whether you're using it within development or whether you're using it like nice outside development. Both are relatively new in that way, particularly within development, I think. So I think Mandy's point is very pertinent here, particularly for smaller companies, and giving them a little bit more help, right, for SMEs, and giving context always, not so much the how. As regulators, what we see outside, we're sitting on the other side of the pond, regulators are very good at telling what's needed, right? That's the job. Regulations, directive, guidelines into what's needed. How you take the what and translate it into a clinically meaningful, point is where they struggle, right? So anything new we bring in from an innovation perspective, always helpful to just give at least the smaller companies, a little bit of a. So I think it's a great point.
And it strikes me there's two things that we are doing differently, and one is creating the innovation accelerator as a route or advice, among other things. But I think actually what we currently call the innovative licensing and access pathway involves patient involvement all the way through. It involves dialogue all the way through. And I think that's why developing that process into almost the business as usual, June, is what I'm thinking is the way, the direction that we need to be going.
Yeah, don't worry, we're thinking that too, and have for some time. It is a prototype for everything.
Yeah. So I feel that I think we've got the potential route to achieve that.
Yeah.
We've just got to do it.
Yeah.
I think is the point that we've been making.
Paul? I think there's also an opportunity for CPRD to be used in the earlier stages of product planning. We want patient engagement right from the beginning, and we want diversity. And so we sort of started to talk about that sort of concept of jury service, where there's really sort of random selection of a patient who's relevant for a particular condition and diversity. So I think that's something we should look at. In terms of clinical trials, this is sort of going perhaps beyond MHRA, but thinking the ecosystem, it's those metrics on each CTU, so the clinical trial units. How quickly are they setting things up? How quickly are they recruiting? So we're facilitating. But if that was in public, so we had a public dashboard as a company, you could say, okay, right, we'll go to Plymouth because we didn't normally think of them, but they're really dynamic and fast, as opposed to perhaps a London unit, which would normally get the attention, and it might just help drive up standards.
I think that's a really practical suggestion, actually. Paul, thank you for that. Okay. Junaid, final question from you.
It's more of a comment really. So 5.6 around novel and decentralised trials. It's really interesting that these types of trials have doubled in the past 3 years, probably really powered by the pandemic. And I think lots of countries are trying to figure out how they build decentralised trials into their regulatory framework. So it's a real opportunity, I believe, for us to be world class at this. And I can only imagine that these types of trial designs will just increase in number moving forward. And it probably also would be very positive in terms of a patient and family experience to be able to run trials completely decentralised. So I really welcome 5.6.
I was actually going to comment on exactly that point, that remote decentralised, the ability to run trials remotely and capture outcomes remotely is a really critical drive. It would be a really critical drive to increase that representativeness, because not all patients are able to travel into centralised units in order to participate in the trial. So that's a really critical point, and as we say in 5.4, we're looking to expand that programme.
Again, it helps to differentiate the UK because I like the ambition, be world class, 100% CPRD, 100% coverage, These are some of the issues that are coming out.
And it also helps us on the follow-up of those patients, because capturing remotely and then following up remotely is really helpful.
Okay, so I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. Again, I think it's a very well-written paper, so thank you, Mark, to you and the team that have put this together. But I think we've spent a lot of time talking about CPRD coverage, as a clear, metric and measure. Let's aim for the 100%. But it's also important that we maintain that representation, not just geography, but across all the different patient characteristics that are important. And we should never even forget about the gender balance. I think for clinical trials, has historically never been where it needs to be. I think we think about a dialogue with companies, and so we talked about Innovation Accelerator and ILAC as examples of that. I think actually Paul had a really interesting idea there around how we maybe look at the external metrics, the performance of individual clinical trial units to again help to, is that something that we can help to facilitate? It's not necessarily, it's maybe a service we could consider for companies. We wouldn't regulate that, but it's someone in the system maybe could put that together. I like the idea of developing the competence to be world-class at decentralised trial design as key points.
All I would add is this is the start of the process, so if further ideas occur, please do send them in. because I've heard a lot of good stuff, but I feel we might be time constrained on this one.
Yeah.
So,
and there's a lot of experience in the room as well, so yeah, please feel free just to talk to Mark directly.
thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, let's just move gear a moment and move on to patient safety. So, Mercy, as chair of the Patient Safety Engagement Committee, you've had another meeting and another report. You can assume we've read it. Are there any particular nuggets you want us to focus on? And then we'll take questions.
Yeah, I'm going to just highlight a few things. But just given the discussion we've had before, just to say that things like ILAP and CPRD do come to the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee, and we're particularly looking at all those things about how patients and the public are involved in those systems, as well as what they're doing kind of to engage people outside and involve people too. So we take kind of a closer look from those particular perspectives, so to reassure the board that's what we do. Just to introduce this paper, we had three things that came to the committee really. Effective patient representation on committees and groups, healthcare professionals engagement strategy and the priorities that to go within that strategy. And also we looked at contribution of patient engagement involvement optimised for clinical trials. So we definitely have that clinical trials discussion. And lots of the comments that were kind of coming through in that discussion as well. Obviously, we were very happy to have two new non-execs, Raj Long and Professor Graham Cook on our committee. Graham, unfortunately, was only able to join us at the end, but rightly for the clinical trials stuff, so that was very, very useful.
Timing is everything, Graham.
So just to say that the two things that we first looked at, which is about patient representation on committees and groups, and this includes our independent committees as well. It was quite at an early stage, and we were just looking at the scoping on that. So it was really looking at kind of areas that might kind of cover, including terminology, identification of patients, training and support for people, tenure, payment, conflict of interest and process, as well as evaluation. And the other paper that was that has been to the committee before, but still was at more of a kind of a scoping stage, was the consultation on healthcare professionals and their interaction with the agency. I guess we had comments on both of those, but they were at a relatively early stage. We would certainly want the healthcare professionals consultation strategy to come back with more detail and more kind of where they're basing that interaction with, because that's quite important. Because obviously having a healthcare professionals strategy covers such a wide range of people that we just want to know how targeted it is. And I know the agency has done a lot of targeted work, but our committee needed to see a bit more about that. So that's what I'd want to say about that. And then we had a really, really useful discussion, I think, around clinical trials and patient engagement. Talked a lot about remote trials and you know, the opportunities for that and engagement with diversity of people, as already been said. And I just wanted to highlight the patients' reported outcomes special interest group, which seems within the agency to have a lot of traction, and that's very encouraging. So I just wanted to highlight that as well.
Great. Just speaking personally, I get a lot of assurance from the way that you've been looking at the patient engagement activities. Just thinking of your future work plan, what thoughts have you got about being able to provide the board assurance on more the patient safety processes that the agency operates?
Well, it's good timing because we have an opportunity now with our new non-execs as well and the new terms of reference that the board have just signed off to have another look at really how we go about our business. And that will give us an opportunity to make sure that we balance both those kind of things, from patient safety and engagement. We obviously have quite a key eye to patient safety, and I'm sitting next to the Chief Safety Officer, of course. It might be better when we look at our terms of reference to just be much more focused. So that's why we're having another look in committee at our terms of reference to really tighten up, I think. We've had 5 committee meetings this year. We started in February. We're going to be looking at terms of reference by the end of this year, and it will give us a really good chance to kind of see what balance have we got, what do we really want to concentrate on, and how do we really get assurance for the board.
And I think it's back to the conversation you and I have had actually this evening.
Yes.
It's just making sure that there's sufficient breadth. Because actually we can't necessarily, it's the executive's responsibility to operate the systems clearly, but we're looking for assurance across a breadth of responsibilities. But it's making sure they're not too broad that it's meaningless, and it's not too specific that it's too deep, and it becomes interfering. So I think there's a balance to be struck.
And it's interesting us talking about some of these kind of leading new services, because in a way we're kind of drilling down because we want to pull out those kind of things that are going to work across the agency. And that's why the patient-reported outcomes special interest group is really interesting, because it operates across the agency. And I think we can take kind of examples like that to encourage people across the agency, and of course with our new transformation plans as well, to start working together and learn from each other about what really works.
Right. Okay. So, colleagues, obviously this is a report providing some assurance to the board around some of these particular activities. Were there any particular questions, or is the board content?
It's tying into John's earlier comment around spending reviews and prioritization, right? Because something's. So in the context of safety within PSAP, which is a key component, because I think we are focusing on the patient engagement, and you're quite right, Chair, we have to bring in the safety piece now. Will any spending impact, for example, if Safety Connect, I'm just pulling something out of my head here, is like, would that be discussed with the committee and with the board? Because clearly it needs to be aligned overall. So key question is, if you, in the context of safety, example, Safety Connect, if there is going to be prioritization of spending under the spending review, will the committee as well as the board get a chance to look at that? Because anything on safety, technology is such a key piece of safety, right? That's where my concern is coming in from. Okay. Will we get some insight on it so that we can align beforehand and understand the risks together?
Shall I comment first and then...
I'm going to ask our Chief Executive to comment.
Well, that would be absolutely great. But just to say that we're going to have a joint meeting with between the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee and the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee for this very reason. So I think on the kind of the board kind of structure, the assurance committees, there are times where we really do want to get together and things.
I think there's two things here, isn't there? Because actually I think that's definitely on the assurance side. I think also part of your question was about what about the decision making when it comes to spending review, and I think that's very much June's purview. So is there anything you want to add, June, in terms of how you would advise the board outcomes from the spending review and so forth?
Although I was going to just pick up the point about the joint look at this. It's a key part of the future transformed agency, but the two committees will have different responsibilities when they look at this one major deliverable. And I would assume that, Mercy, you'll be asking, is there a truly responsive system that listens to and acts on what patients are bringing to us? And in ARAC, it will be, are we getting value for driving this major piece of implementation, which I have to say is already beginning. So it comes together, and both aspects, there's a synergy between them.
And it needs to, I guess, then feed into the wider strategy of the agency, you know, in terms of what came out of Cumberledge, all of that. So we got to then push it back and say, in terms of the beginning. Thank you.
But I would hope that, Mercy, you would see a natural progression from that starting point to every aspect of safety. Has the patient perspective on the nature of the risk, on risk management proposals, you know, on the complete outcome picture that we want to see, has that been adequately reflected from the detection of a signal through to someone perhaps who's able to accept a certain amount of risk? And I think that's going to be a major piece under the S of PSEC.
Yeah, okay. That was my first meeting with the PSEC team, so I'm trying to understand a little bit around how things will come together.
And it's really important we identify if there are any gaps as well, or where, you know, different committees should be working together a bit more.
Good. Okay. So, can I take it that the board is content that we are assured with the work that's been to date, but there's clearly another work programme and more things to do? Okay, so let's take that as assurance received. Thank you very much. That brings us on to the last substantive item, which is around risk. So that's page 44 of the board pack. John, again, you can assume we've read it. Any key points you want to bring to our attention?
Thank you, Chair. So perhaps just a brief overview of actually how this process runs. So our governance framework around risk is pretty well established. There's a risk advisory group that runs at working level that then comes up into an executive committee risk and assurance meeting, which actually is joint with our internal audit colleagues. And then clearly that feeds into Michael's Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, and then ultimately this board. There's been a fair amount of work over the last quarter or so to improve how we articulate the various risks and tighten controls around them, because clearly the key area is mitigation. Our internal audit function will also be undertaking an independent review of our risk control framework over the next quarter anyway. That will automatically come to Michael's committee as well. Just some brief comments on some of the risks that we've covered in the paper. Risk 12, the future operating model, the reason that one's still rated high is because we're saying there's a bit of a lag between seeing the benefits of the controls that we've implemented. So it's probably a timing issue around that one. Risk 2, patient engagement. We've revised the patient and public involvement strategy delivery dates in response to feedback that our original dates were perhaps a little bit ambitious. There's clearly more resourcing required on that side that will flow as we populate our new operating model, but there's going to be a bit of a lag between those appointments being made and impact on that area. Trading fund status, there's a lot of work underway in that area. The technical finance changes are on track. We've got a joint workshop with the Department of Health finance team around some of the activities that now need to happen. There's clearly a link across to the transformation side to some of the cultural changes that I think, to be honest, we are probably underestimating as we move into a new environment. And again, internal audit will coming back later in the year to look at that one. Activities in the finance area on that one. And then just finally, risk 1, effectively the Cumberledge or the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review. Not as high a risk rating as some of the other ones we've got on the register, but it's been included because we think some of the mitigations around this are important, and clearly it's also fairly high profile. So that's an area Alison's been looking at and may want to come back on in time with some more detail. There's also finally just an allusion in the paper to the DDAC technology roadmap, which, as Michael was indicating, is moving to the right, and we discussed the impact of that on spend, etc. So I think that is an area that we do need to look at, and we may well want to consider whether that's under the auspices of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee at the November meeting, and then come back to this board. That's really all I wanted to highlight, Stephen.
Okay, I think that's a really helpful overview, John, actually. Thank you for that. Michael, just before we get into the detail of the specific risks, is there anything else you want to talk to the board about, because we've got a number of new board members around the process?
Not the process particularly. If Stephen, if you mind, I'd make one comment that looking at this, I think in terms of managing the agency's risk, it does the job and it highlights a number of issues, and all credit to the executive and colleagues of taking this forward. I think it's not a bad point in time to just stop and take stock, really. You know, does this really reflect the conversation that we've just been having around risk? Because it seems to me we are faced with the classic dilemma. As a regulator, we need to maintain patient safety, but we really want to support commercial approaches that increase patient access. And the only other thing that I felt was, if you forget the context in which we operate, if I looked at this and I looked at the risk register of the European regulator or the FDA in the States, would we be focusing on, is there some similarity there? Because I do wonder whether we are at risk of just getting into the issues that impact on the MHRA. So I think the risk register is good. I think it's helping us manage all the things that we need to manage to ensure this organisation is resilient and successful. I think my question is, at some point, and it may be, we talked about this, around risk appetite, that discussion, because I think we've got a bit further to go in defining that, because it will help, as John says, in defining the culture of the organisation going forward. So a long introduction to me. I'm happy we're going to review it at the Audit Committee in a couple of weeks. It's that bigger picture issue for me that we might be missing.
Can I just pick up on your bigger picture issue, just in terms of John or June, any sort of comparison? Have we actually looked at whether we can even access the risk registers of Europe or other regulators, the FDA or anyone else, just by way of comparison?
So we did an exercise actually probably 2 or 3 years ago now around risk appetite, and that did look at some others, but actually I would agree with Michael, we could probably update that helpfully. I think we should be revisiting our risk appetite. Also at that time we did a self-assessment of our risk management maturity and some work to move up on that. There actually is a new toolkit coming out very soon from the government risk management profession, and actually we've seen that in pilot stage, so we may well want to consider whether we have a look at it and take that opportunity to self-assess, and as Michael's prompting, where do we want to develop further?
June?
I think it would be good value to look again at the EMA, because there are many parallels. They clearly went through massive change 2 or 3 years ago, and it's time, I think, we thought about how risks, while we divide and mitigate, have a confluence. And at the moment, the massive impact of change, I think, creates more risk in other areas. We can't drop the ball. Everybody is well aware of that, but we have a goal that we're working towards. The prize is great for public health, but getting there and the cultural change, the outcome-focused, delivery-focused agency is a massive turnaround. And therefore, I think it would be good, Chair, if the ARAC helps us in this regard. I think the way we divide things up may not be the right approach at the moment, because risk at the moment, I think, is significantly enhanced across the piece.
Yeah, so I think Michael makes an interesting point about the international perspective. The other perspective from my view is I'm just also wondering about how the UK system risk is captured, because we are part of, as Paul described it, an ecosystem. And Carly, I'm just thinking from your experience working in the department, is that something that the department monitors, or is that something that we could play a more active part in? Do you think? Have you any thoughts about, because at the end of the day, it's all very well us doing our part, and it might be perfect, but if other parts of the system don't, or if we're letting another part of the system down, it still doesn't help patients and industry in the end.
Yeah, so the department will definitely be thinking about that cross-system risk. I think that there is a potential that they will think about it from a specific sort of issue perspective.
Yes.
So I think there would be space for us to step into that and talk to the department about how we can assist in having that more strategic discussion across the system, rather than thinking about it from a particular issue-based or ministerial interest perspective.
which then obviously narrows your frame of reference.
Yeah. I was thinking if we're going to take the opportunity to do a stock take, as you described it, Michael, I think we need to think about the things that are absolutely within our purview. Then there's actually the international context, then there's the UK system context, and I don't want to create an industry here, but if we want to think about strategic risk, we probably need a slightly broader perspective than we haven't got that particular IT system put in on the 13th of February.
With the trading fund coming to an end at the end of March, I think it's absolutely essential that we do this.
Could I comment? Just a very quick one. I have the privilege of periodically attending the meetings of all the chairs of the various audit committees within the health family, and the last one that we had a presentation of the risk register looking at what I was struck by was at least, I'd say, quarter, would you say a third of the risks relate to the MHRA's responsibility, not in a negative way, but we are influencing such a significant part of the healthcare system, in the current climate at the moment, and I don't think that's fully, I don't think people are fully aware of that, the importance of the role that it's playing.
Okay, Raj, you want to come in?
Thank you. It's very much in that area of internal systems. It's not evident from the paper. While we seek to have partnerships with NHS Digital, NHSE, the various families of the health system, the systems need to talk. Is interoperability an issue? It's a very basic question, because if the systems can't talk at that level, we have a very different issue. And if that is an issue, to realise your full potential.
Yes, our tech roadmap is really focused on creating that proper alignment and integration with the NHS Health Security Agency. CQC, for example, making sure that our risk management advice is acted on. So it is a major and achievable deliverable.
And achievable.
Working, I think, closely with NHS Digital and NHSX. It's a national digital transformation strategy that we're part of, and on the authority level. So I think we've got the right pieces of work in place. But I think the new Chief Technology Officer will need to be driving this.
You see, one of the things we've been doing, Raj, on the clinical trials area, the combined ways of working with HRA, and we've put in a new system. Obviously, ILAP is effectively a new system working with NICE and the SMC. So I think actually that there is a fundamental interoperability issue. Baroness Cumberledge highlighted that very clearly in her report. And so I think we've been doing it, sort of almost section by section, where some of the processes are clearly interacting. I think data flow and the use of data for safety management is going to be absolutely crucial. So on that basis, we're going to need to, that's why they're linked with NHS Digital, I think are going to be strategically important to us because of that. Because we'll need data flow. And interoperability is the only way you're going to make that happen. So I think you make it a valid point. Okay, Ada.
Just kind of building on that, but a question specifically around risk one. The one area that was read was the additional funding needed to build our data capability. And I just wondered, if we didn't get that additional funding, do we have any mitigations in place?
John?
To be honest, none other than prioritising it, as I was referring to earlier. So, our ability to secure additional short-term funding is pretty limited. So that gap year next year, if we don't get, as a minimum, what we've applied for in terms of transition and our kind of priority one item, it will be an issue.
Thank you, John. It'd be great to understand the tech roadmap, and I know we talked about it briefly, and maybe we can do this offline for people who are interested, because not everyone would be interested, but I'd love to spend a bit of time discussing.
I think we'll need to revisit the technology roadmap.
We are all interested. I'm not saying that as a platitude. We are all absolutely seized of this, and the Transform Agency will only work with that level of engagement. So it isn't allocated to a Chief Technology officer, and if I've given that impression, make sure I'm corrected.
Yeah. See, the board approved the technology roadmap in May, and I think that had some of the right strategic decisions in. You know, I think the reality of going through the transformation components has meant that there have been some delays, and actually with thinking about spending as well, we need to probably think about some sort of reprioritisation. So I do see it's an item that will need to come back to the board. I'm not sure as of today what date that will be, but I think certainly the board will need to reconsider that in due course. So I think we're all interested, Hayden, so you make a valid point. Mandy?
Yeah, and I think building on that point, one of the things that June and I have spoken about is, I mean, it's captured under the future operating model, which sounds a bit organisational, but actually it's about getting the processes, the technology and the people working together, and that's a gap we still have. It's a risk we're still having, and that's where we're struggling with the technology roadmap. It's a little bit about, I don't know the process, I don't know what I'm building, and there's the integration, and that cultural piece, as June said, is something we have to work on. And that's perhaps a little bit slower than we expected to happen. But that's a lot of that, the risk is captured in that future operating model. It maybe needs to come out a little bit more strongly, because one thing seems to be delaying the other. And I think that's something we need to address.
You see, I think, John, you mentioned in the paper about the technology risk needing further articulation, and I think actually your proposal in your intro of actually discussing that with ARAC as a first step, I would suggest is absolutely the right way forward. But as Mandy also says, luckily Mandy's on ARAC, but also it's chairing the Organisation Development Committee. It has a direct impact on the implementation of the organisational structure too. So I think Mandy will be well placed to work out if there's actually further components you will need assurance from an organisational development point of view, but actually thinking about the specific risk, Michael, and your committee think about that specific risk. I think that feels like the right place to start. And then I think also I'd probably encourage us to think about doing a sort of a broader review of strategic risk for the agency, thinking about the points we made earlier around international and UK system risk. I think that's worthy of consideration.
Can I just come back on one point, Stephen, which is, I think in my response to Hyde, I've made the finances sound a bit more like a cliff edge, which actually it is. So it's primarily next year when we have that gap before we put in new fees. So it's perfectly reasonable that as we implement a new fee structure, we should factor in the cost of the systems required, etc., to support that activity. So once we can get that in place, we're in more of an even keel equilibrium. It's just the gap before we put that in place, which occurs next year, and is the maximum point of our systems investment. So that's the issue. So it would be short-term prioritisation, but it would be quite an issue next year.
Yeah, it's obviously difficult for new colleagues who just joined the board. There's a number of moving parts here, and obviously part of the organisational transformation is around cost reduction. Clearly, part of the process improvement that we need is around efficiency and productivity, which is also a lever that we need to pull. There's obviously then thinking about longer-term fees and other sources of income to help fund the agency, and then finally, then there's also the request to government for further additional funding for specific projects, initiatives to support the longer-term strategy of the UK health system. So I don't think that there's no one component. It's very much multifactorial is how I would describe it. I don't know whether that's done it justice, John, but I think there are a number of moving parts here, I think is how I would summarise it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good description, Stephen, and hopefully we should get a clearer view in the next few weeks, and then that will enable us to start planning a little bit better.
Yeah, and the spending review, I think, is likely to be determined within the month. And I think within that will give us time to then plan and make the priorities and the trade-offs if and when we need them. So I think in terms of risk, I think the key action is back to you, Michael. I think I specifically wanted, probably a couple of times a year for the risk register to come to the board, because I don't see risk is just a ARAC responsibility. It's actually a board responsibility. We are all ultimately accountable. So that's why it's important that we will have the opportunity just to see that and to have this type of conversation with a much more detailed seeking assurance, Michael, will be through your committee. If that works for everybody. Carly, anything else I need to add? No. June?
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, that being the case then, that's the end of the substantive items. Now my favourite part of the board meeting is actually the question and answer sessions with members of the public. So thank you to members of the public who've been making questions and placing questions. I think if it's possible to bring Rachel onto the screen, there she is, thank you. Rachel, good afternoon now. So Rachel Bosworth, our Director of Communications, has been watching the various questions being asked by members of the public and also reviewing the ones that have been submitted in advance. So Rachel, you're our question master, and then I'll try and direct them to the relevant people to answer them. So do you want to ask the first question, please, Rachel?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. And just to say, we've got a very large number of questions today. So if we don't manage to get to all of the questions, we'll undertake to come back to those people who've asked specific questions in writing following the meeting. So if we don't get to your question today, you will be hearing from us with a written answer. So if we start off with a question about the British Pharmacopoeia, and it's about the new edition, which was published in August 2021, and why it has the year as 2022 when it's actually published in August. And the questioner is saying this may be confusing in future years. And could there be retrospective publication instead of forward publication?
Okay, Mark, can I come to you?
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question. So the British Pharmacopoeia is published as an annual event, and it's published in August, but dated from January the 1st the next year, because it is enforced for that calendar year. It's published in advance so that any organisations following it have 4 months to make sure their practices are in place. So it's actually done from our perspective of the users, and it's actually a common process for other pharmacopoeias, such as the European Pharmacopoeia. The retrospective ones aren't changeable, so that you can refer back and know exactly what was in place in the calendar year that it's dated for.
Great, thank you for that. For our second question, Rachel, I think we were due to have one of the members of the public on the screen.
Yes, I think we're going to go to Simon Griffith next, who I think is just joining.
Simon, good morning. I could see you at last. Thank you for joining us this morning. Could you just sort of state your name and also your affiliation, please, and then ask your question.
My name is Simon Griffith, and I'm affiliated with the Cure Parkinson's Trust. My question is one of patient power and one of missing medicines. So my question is, how can patients encourage the scientific clinical testing of potential medicines where these could fill a crucial gap in medicines available? For example, treating Parkinson's dyskinesia with medical marijuana or mesdopetam.
I think that's a very interesting question, Simon. Thank you very much. I'll pass you on to Alison Cave, our Chief Safety Officer, to answer that one.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Griffiths, for this very interesting question. As you're probably aware, the MHRA is the competent authority for authorisation of clinical trials in the UK, and while we play a leading role in protecting and improving public health and supporting innovation where we can through scientific research and development, our role does not include carrying out clinical trials, and neither does our remit extend to encouraging research activity in certain sectors. However, having said that, we're very keen to encourage the involvement of patients in our work. We've recently published our patient involvement strategy, where we're setting out how we might engage and involve the public and patient at every step of our regulatory journey. And we're at an early stage on this, but one key strand of that, which you may be interested in, is the involving patients within our innovative licensing and access pathway, or ILAP as we generally term it, which you may have heard about today. And that was launched at the beginning of this year, and its primary ambition there is to reduce the time to market for some of the innovative medicines and ensure that patients are involved at every stage of that journey, including influencing which products are given an innovative licensing passport to move through the process.
Okay, Simon, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I think I don't want to take too long, but briefly, I feel that patients need to be able to have some influence as well on the choice of which medicine get tested, and so if that helps that process, that would be very good.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question. I can just reassure you that patient involvement is the number one strategic objective of the agency in our delivery plan, and as Alison rightly says, involving patients at every step of the regulatory process is absolutely critical. From clinical trials through to regulation, through to the patient safety surveillance. So thank you for your time this morning. We really appreciate it.
Many thanks.
And if it's okay, we'll move on to the next question, Rachel.
Thank you. So the next question is about a product called isotretinoin, which is a drug for severe acne, and the board has discussed this on previous occasions. So the questioner has said that they're very concerned that little or no safety precautions were put in place to protect young patients while the isotretinoin expert working group was reconvened in September 2019. The questioner says that the death of a young man in June while undergoing isotretinoin treatment has just come to their attention, and their question is whether any safety review should take more than 2 years. And does the MHRA need to do more to protect patients during prolonged and long drawn out processes such as this?
Okay, a very important patient safety question there. Now, Alison, can I come back to you again as Chief Safety Officer?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I'd like to start first by expressing our deepest condolences to the family of the man who died under such tragic circumstances earlier this year. We heard of this case with deep regret, and we are following up on all the details of the reports, but our thoughts are very much with the family. I would like to reassure the public that the safety of isotretinoin has been carefully monitored throughout the period of this review, during which time the benefits of treatment were considered to outweigh the risks for the majority of patients. But I would also like to reassure that healthcare professionals were informed of the review. They were reminded about the risks associated with isotretinoin, including the need to fully counsel patients on the potential risks and be vigilant for the potential serious side effects through articles, for example, in our bulletin called Drug Safety Update in both August and November of last year. And they had previously been reminded about the risks of, for example, neuropsychiatric disorders in an article in June 2019. So with regard just to the timelines of the safety review, I'd just like to highlight that we are undertaking an extremely thorough assessment of information collected from a wide variety of sources, including patients and other stakeholders. So all of the yellow cards that we've received, all of publications and research, we've contacted other regulators and also asked companies to submit overviews of their records of adverse drug reactions and their assessment of those. I'd also like to point out that we did a consultation exercise that was open from November of 2020 to February 16th of this year, and through that process we received 650 responses to that consultation process, and we carried out 3 engagement sessions with patients, carers and other stakeholders to hear the wide range of reviews. And we're currently collating all of this information together in a report, the recommendations of which are in the process of being finalised and will be published as soon as possible.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alison. That's a very comprehensive response. You know, obviously, because we've asked for comments and input from the public, you know, to have 659 responses is immense. Yeah. But inevitably, the consequence of that is it takes time. And so we want to thoroughly review those responses to make sure the expert committee's got all the information available to provide the advice to the agency accordingly. So thank you for that. For the fourth question, I believe we're expecting a Dr. Samantha Saunders to join us.
Yes, that's right.
Hi there.
Hi, is that Sam or is it Samantha?
It's Sam Saunders. Hi.
Hello,
Thank you so
Sam.
much. Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a question.
Can you really first state your affiliation and then ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm speaking on behalf of the animal protection organisation Cruelty Free International. So my question for the panel today is, how is MHRA reducing reliance on animal use for safety and efficacy testing of medicines and medical devices? Thank you.
Right, that's a very important question. Mark, as our Chief Scientific and Research and Innovation Officer, would you care to answer that?
With pleasure. Thank you very much for your question, Sam. So the agency is absolutely committed to reducing the reliance on animal use for safety and efficacy testing in medicines across the board. We do this in-house. We have our NIPSC unit, which is signed up to the Concord out of openness, so that we make public the tests we do ourselves to guarantee the safety of medicines being made available to the UK public. We're also a close partner with the UK's National Centre on the 3 Rs, which, as I think you know, is reduce, replace and refine animal testing. And we have a long track record of actually working on the experiments to get rid of animal testing. For example, we have 20 years experience in the polio vaccine area of effectively removing the need to test on primates and first replacing that with mice testing and then totally replacing it with in vitro testing, which still hasn't in no way compromised the safety of the patient. That work is published, and we actually both present and provide training on that work, while staff actually engage very closely with societies to make sure that that is fully out there as much as we can do. We also, in the area of devices, work closely on the ISO specification 10993, which has built into it how to actually give guidance to companies on reducing any kind of animal testing for medical devices, and our staff actively promote it. We look for any other opportunities we can do, because it is vital that we approach this in a responsible way to reduce our reliance on animals.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. Hopefully that answers your question, Sam. I think we're sort of trying to set the right example by our own experimentation, reducing the use of animals, as Mark says. And similarly, we're trying to make sure the regulations reflect that too for the people that we regulate. So hopefully that answers your question. So thank you very much for raising a really important topic. Thank you. The next question, Rachel, please.
Yes, thank you. This is a question on assistive technology. So the questioner is commenting on wheelchairs and scooters, and saying that they believe audible warning instruments should be mandatory on Class 2 scooters and wheelchairs, because many people walk at less than 4 miles an hour. And their question is whether the MHRA can influence the government to make use of warning bells mandatory on cycles, because wheelchairs and scooters are not to have rear view mirrors.
Okay, so can I come back to you, Alison, please, on as our Chief Safety Officer on this one? What's the MHRA role in this?
Absolutely. So it's a very interesting question, actually, and it's quite timely, because on the 28th of September, the Devices Division actually delivered an online workshop with patients and patient representative groups with an interest in assistive technology to explore the issues. And we had some very insightful perspectives and added very valuable data on this area. And within that workshop, we sought feedback on published information on the MHRA Assistive Technology webpage, its planned update, and also views on perception of risks, including the appropriate road use of mobility scooters and powered wheelchairs. With regard to the specific issue about rear view mirrors and warning bells, we can certainly pass this feedback to the relevant British Standards Institute committee that reviews and updates product information for wheelchairs and mobility scooters, so that they can give appropriate consideration to this matter. We're also in contact with the Department of Transport around matters concerning their safe use outdoors, so that there's appropriate advice on instructions, appropriate instructions for use for these products as they're placed on the market. I hope that answers the question and provides reassurance.
Yeah, so it's obviously very much a multi-agency response, I think is my summary of that one, but we will play our part in that, I think that's clear. Thank you for that. Our next question, we actually had two questions on a very similar subject, so we thought we'd actually take the opportunity to promote or introduce two members of the public who wanted to raise a question today. We've got a Mrs. Indira Taylor and Mr. Martin O'Neill. So if they could please join the meeting room, that would be helpful. I can see
I think
Martin,
they're both just coming on the screen.
You just bear with us a moment. And Indira is there at the top. Thank you very much. So as you both asked a very similar question, what I thought we could maybe do today is actually ask you to both ask your question, and then we'll give you one combined answer, because I think the two things overlap. Mrs. Indira Taylor, could I just ask you to just introduce yourself and what your affiliation is, and then ask your question, please?
Yeah. My name is Indira Taylor, and I'm one of the victims, I call myself, for the mesh complications. And I've had several surgeries to have the mesh removed, but I still have some residual mesh in me, and that's still causing me some issues. And I just like to know what MHRA doing to reduce the complications in the patient, and how that relates to the recommendations as made by Julia Cumberledge in her report.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and again, sorry to hear about the personal challenges that you've had with this particular treatment. Martin O'Neill, could I just bring you into the conversation and just again ask you just to explain your affiliation or interest in this, and then ask your question, please?
Yes, my name is Martin. I'm also a patient affected by mesh, and my question is the following. With the changes that are being proposed, the clear question is, case in point, TVT pelvic mesh, will all these types of surgical mesh devices available on the market be looked at more stringently? Also, will the MHRA consider that the cart came before the horse, being as now the medical industry is only accepting the truth of the damage that mesh can do in people? Based on this, would the MHRA consider that irrespective of how many people surgical mesh may help, the damage done and can do to any person is over and above the action of implanting, meaning the damage caused when mesh goes wrong is more catastrophic than the issue of recurrence?
Okay, well, again, I think that's a very clear question. Thank you very much for that, Martin. And again, I'm very sorry to hear any complications that you've had personally as well. Certainly, if I can come back to Alison Cave again, our Chief Safety Officer, can you just provide to both of our guests, some sort of reassurance on this issue?
Yes. Thank you very much for the question to both Martin and Indra, and I'm sorry to hear about the complications you've received from the mesh. So I thought it might be quite helpful if I take us back a few years to sort of say what we're doing, what we have done, and what we're doing in what we're currently doing. So just to give a little bit of background, over the past we've taken a number of actions with regards to vaginal mesh complications and other types of mesh. We've hosted workshops in 2011 and 12 with leading clinicians to really seek views and hear advice from those clinicians, and also to provide advice to women and healthcare professionals on mesh. We've shared information with other regulators to help us build a better picture of experience with mesh, and your experiences also, are incredibly helpful. We've done several reviews of manufacturers' mesh data, including clinical data, instructions for use to check where it's adequate to meet the requirements of the law and where it was not. And we reviewed all of the evidence given to the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review to learn even more of the concerns of women and their families. So we do recognise some women develop very serious complications related to urogynecological mesh procedures, and we also must recognise that many women have gained benefit from these surgical procedures, and there are some types of urogynecological mesh that act as the only treatment option for some women. So we absolutely recommend that the use of mesh should only follow a shared decision between a woman and her clinician on her treatment options, following a full discussion of the risks and benefit in order to provide the individual with sufficient information to provide that informed consent. The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, also published a series of patient decision aids to help women and their healthcare team discuss the right treatment options available. We're continuing, of course, to look at many sources of evidence as part of our ongoing safety surveillances, including published studies, as well as all adverse events reported to us by the public, and we continue to encourage anyone who suspects they've had a complication after having a medical device implant to discuss it with their clinician, but also to report it to us via the yellow card scheme. And we're continuing to work with a range of stakeholders, including NHS England, NHS Improvement and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, to assess all potential safety issues, but also to seek clinical advice. One more recent action we would like to highlight is that we've launched the public consultation on the future regulatory system, and we would really welcome your views and views of all patients and public to help us shape our future approach to regulating medical devices such as surgical mesh in the UK. And the consultation includes the suggestion to make all urogynecological mesh devices a Class 3 medical device. Now that would increase the level of pre-market and post-market scrutiny needed for these devices. And so we would really encourage the patients and public to respond to that consultation. And in addition, we're looking for greater transparency around our reporting systems, and that will be going forward shortly. So I hope that provides some reassurance. Thank you.
So I think if I could, on behalf of Martin and Dira, I'm assuming you also, when you mentioned women, you also meant men, because
yes.
the meshes can be used clearly in both genders. There's obviously a lot of work been going on, but I think the most important thing is, I'm sure Martin and Dira want to be convinced and assured that we're going to increase the vigilance in future to avoid the complications that they may have suffered affecting other people. So just briefly, how confident are you that if we can make these devices a Class 3 medical device, that will provide more certainty and more assurance of the safety of these products?
Well, it will give a more in-depth review of those products as a class of devices. So it would mean that the scrutiny at the level of authorisation was increased.
Yep.
And also, of course, we continue with that post-market surveillance with our Safety Connect system, encouraging all patients and public to report adverse events as they hear it. But also, we continue to look at all published studies that come through to us from the published literature, but also from other international regulators. We're continuing a very active surveillance. We're very aware and very alive to this issue and understand the complications that some patients have suffered as a result of mesh procedures.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Martin and Dira for raising a really important issue here. I think it's very clear we understand that there's an opportunity for improvement, and actually, as Alison has described, a number of actions that we're taking to provide a better level of safety assurance on these products. So thank you for raising an important issue, and obviously we'll take that away and work on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and
Thank you.
Have a good day. Okay, Rachel, I want to make sure we have plenty of time on the people that were going to be on screen. We've got a number of other sort of questions to just, if we can go through relatively quickly now with the time we've got available. Next question, please.
Yeah, so the next question relates to testing of cholera vaccines for the WHO stockpile. And there was a reference in the Chief Executive's report to NIBSC testing and releasing 2 batches of cholera vaccine for the World Health Organization stockpile. And the questioner is saying, if these batches have already been used, does this mean that WHO has none left in their stockpile?
Okay. Mark, I think there's a very quick answer to this.
Very quick answer, it certainly does. The programme is actually managed by UNICEF, and it's there to ensure that this vaccine is widely available. The testing is routine to check that the batches being submitted to UNICEF are actually safe to use. And I'm sure that UNICEF will make sure there's adequate supply.
Okay, so this is a standard part of our process, I think. Is what
It's absolutely standard part of the quality testing of vaccines, so they're safe for use.
Okay, great. Next question, please, Rachel.
Yeah. Thank you. The next one relates to the MHRA transformation programme, and the questioner is saying, with the publicised projected 20 to 25% reduction in staffing at the MHRA, what are some of the ways you might be transforming the way you operate to minimise any impact on approval of medicines and other day-to-day operations?
Okay, an important question there. June, can I come to you on this one, please?
Well, thank you. And we will be transforming the way we operate in a whole range of ways. Given the time, Chair, I'll just highlight 3. The way we group our teams will change around the life cycle of a product to make sure it smoothly moves from the discovery, development to deployment. We'll be looking at simplifying our processes, and after the EU exit, we have a big opportunity there. And we'll be rebuilding our technology infrastructure to support all of that. So those are just 3 ways, but overall we're moving from being a reactive regulator to a very proactive one, with exactly what you have in mind to minimise any impact and in fact improve how we see outcomes from the work that we do. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I think we'll inevitably we'll come back to that comment time and time again actually in the coming months. It's a very live issue for us, but we absolutely want to maintain the service that we can offer industry. Okay, Rachel, I'm just conscious of time. Can we maybe make this one the last one, and then we'll maybe need to sum up and we'll talk about the next steps.
Yeah, of course. So if we take a question about ethics committees, and the questioner is asking whether we could open up a direct pathway to ethics committees for participating patient representatives in trials or approvals, so that they can report to the ethics committee if they believe that patient safety is being sidelined for commercial gain.
Okay. Mark, can I come to you again, please?
Certainly, with pleasure. The ethics, Research Ethics Committee's review of trials is actually overseen by the Health Research Authority, the HRA. And the HRA have a mechanism by which trial participants can report concerns or complaints, and that policy on reporting is freely available, and it is designed specifically to address the complaints that the questioner raises. So, but where the MHRA can help is that where it is appropriate, the MHRA clinical practice inspectors can also inspect a trial if there is a belief that it is not adhering to good ethical practice, and they have the power to take regulatory action if it is required. So hopefully that will reassure the questioner.
Thank you for that, Mark. Rachel, I'm assuming that there are other questions we've not been able to get to today. So can I just ask again, as we did last month, for any questions that have not been asked in public, can we make sure that there's going to be a written response to the questioner to make sure that we can complete that loop?
Yes, you're right, Stephen. There's a number of questions that we haven't had time to answer, so we'll pick those up in writing direct to the questioners after the meeting.
That's great. Well, I would like to thank everybody who has asked questions today. As I said, it's a very valuable part of the process for us to hear directly from members of the public. But we've spent half an hour of our 2.5 meeting on those questions. So I'm very sorry we haven't got to all of them today, but I think the quality of the questions improve every month, and I hope we're giving you, an appropriate response. I'd also just like to thank the staff in the agency who've contributed to the production of the papers today. And I'd just like to close by thanking everyone for their involvement. And just to remind us that the purpose of the MHRA is to protect and improve patient health. That's our raison d'etre. And we'll continue to do that, I think, as we've talked about today, by enabling scientific innovation, by accelerating patient access to new products. And obviously we'll continue, as we've been talking about very recently, strengthening our patient safety and surveillance systems at every opportunity. So with that in mind, I'd just like to thank everyone for their attention, and I'd like to close the meeting. So thank you everybody, and have a good day.